All right, let's jump right in, shall we?
Eh.
Today, we're diving deep into British colonization in North America.
Oh, an area rich with history.
We've got a mountain of sources, really.
Yeah.
Briefing documents, quizzes, even some YouTube lessons, all sorts of things to get you up to speed.
Yeah,
We're going to be looking at what drove British expansion,
of course.
the impact it had on First Nations,
Right.
and, tag along with some pretty daring explorers. So are you ready to go a little beyond the textbook version of history here?
Absolutely. This is a topic that really brings together economics, politics, and social forces,
Yeah.
We're not just talking about planting flags and claiming territory. We're talking about building empires, shaping societies, and navigating those complex relationships with indigenous peoples.
Yeah. And speaking of empires, we've got to start with that driving force behind so many of them.
Okay.
Mercantilism. You've heard of this.
Oh, absolutely.
Basically, this economic theory treated colonies like,
Like treasure chests.
exactly, full of resources, all ready to be shipped back to Europe and sold for a profit.
It really is like viewing the world as this giant monopoly game, isn't it? It's all about controlling the resources, the trade routes.
Right.
And for nations like Britain, North America just held, well, this immense potential, right?
Yeah.
For furs, timber, fish.
Load of land.
Yeah.
Everything, yeah.
Exactly.
And, our briefing document actually has this great quote that sums up mercantilism pretty well, I think. It says, many imperial powers from Europe used the mercantile system to grow powerful. Mercantilism allowed an imperial country to become rich in gold and silver by selling the resources taken from its colonies. So it was all about, benefiting the home country, right?
Right.
But often, imposing restrictions and those hefty taxes on the people actually living in the colonies.
Absolutely. And this, as you can imagine, sowed the seeds of discontent in the colonies. It's one of the factors that eventually fueled those movements for independence. But, it wasn't just about economic exploitation. Britain had a whole bunch of different motivations for crossing the Atlantic.
Yeah, our notes in the YouTube lessons point to some pretty intense competition
Oh, yeah.
between the European powers at the time. We're talking Britain, France, Spain,
Yeah.
all locked in this global struggle for dominance. And establishing colonies in North America, it was kind of like claiming a strategic foothold on the world stage, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Think of it as a high-stakes game of chess. Each nation is vying for control of these key territories and resources. Colonizing North America, it wasn't just about economics, it was about projecting power, asserting dominance on a global scale.
And back in Britain, there were some pretty strong social and economic pressures pushing people to, seek new opportunities across the ocean. Overcrowding, limited land.
Religious persecution.
Yeah. So for many, the colonies really seemed like this land of promise.
Exactly. Some were looking for economic advancement, while others, like, the Puritans,
The Quakers.
the Baptists,
Yeah.
they were fleeing religious persecution, all yearning for a place where they could, practice their faith freely, build their communities.
Right, according to their beliefs.
Exactly.
So it's this really complex web of motivations at play here.
It is.
Economic ambition,
Geopolitical strategy,
social pressures.
religious fervor.
It's all converging
Yeah.
in this story of British colonization.
Precisely. And it's this interplay of factors that, makes this period so fascinating to unpack. But to really get a grasp on the British approach to colonization, we kind of need to compare it to another big player on the North American stage.
New France.
Exactly.
These two colonial powers, they had very different ways of doing things,
Yeah.
which ultimately shaped those very distinct societies that emerged in North America.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like comparing two different recipes,
Oh, I like that.
right? The ingredients might be similar, but the final dish, it tastes totally different.
A great analogy. And the briefing document and YouTube lessons really highlight how the 13 colonies, which were established by the British, they grew much faster than New France.
And why was that?
Well, I think for starters, their goals were very different. You see, the British, they were focused on establishing those permanent settlements and diversifying their economy beyond just resource extraction. So they encouraged agriculture, trade, different industries.
Right.
This attracted a wider range of settlers, created a much more dynamic society.
Meanwhile, the French, largely driven by that fur trade, were more about extracting resources
Exactly.
and sending them back to France.
Right. They established trading posts, forged alliances with First Nations to, secure access to those valuable furs. But their settlements, they remained fairly small and focused on that fur trade.
And didn't climate play a role in this as well? I mean, that milder weather in the southern colonies where the British settled, that allowed for year-round agriculture, right?
Absolutely. More people, a boom in agricultural production. Harsh winters in New France, on the other hand, made farming a lot more challenging. Limited agricultural development, and that also impacted population growth.
So the British colonies are growing rapidly.
They are.
They've got this diverse economy,
Uh-huh.
a more open approach to religious freedom. This, of course, attracted people from all different backgrounds, different nationalities, religious denominations, which all contributes to this rapid expansion.
Precisely. New France, in contrast, it remained predominantly Catholic and French, limiting its appeal to a narrower range of settlers.
Okay, so the British colonies are booming. They're attracting settlers from all over.
Ah.
Now let's shift gears a bit and look at British expansion in Atlantic Canada. This is a region, of course, where colonization had a really profound and often tragic impact on First Nations.
Yes, this is where we see the human cost of colonization really starkly. The arrival of British fishers in Newfoundland had a devastating impact on the Beothuk people.
Right, the indigenous inhabitants of the island. And it's a heartbreaking story. Competition for resources coupled with, the introduction of those European diseases.
It led to violence, displacement.
And ultimately, the extinction of the Beothuk.
Yeah. Our sources, they paint a tragic picture of this once thriving culture just being driven to the brink. And one detail that really stands out to me is the story of Shanna Diffit, the last surviving Beothuk.
Wow.
Before she succumbed to tuberculosis, she shared her people's stories and traditions through drawings, leaving behind this precious record of a lost culture.
A reminder that colonization wasn't just about redrawing maps and establishing settlements. It was about the displacement and often the destruction of entire cultures.
Exactly. And while the Beothuk story is, particularly tragic, it reflects a broader pattern of dispossession and hardship faced by First Nations across the continent.
Further south in Nova Scotia, Britain established Halifax in 1749. A strategic move to really solidify their control over the region. It became a key military and naval base.
Yeah, and even hosted the first elected assembly in British North America.
Right. But Halifax, of course, is also a site of ongoing tension with the Mi'kmaq people who had inhabited the region for centuries. And our briefing document actually quotes Lord Cornwallis, the British governor, issuing orders to, and this is a direct quote, annoy, distress, take, or destroy the Mi'kmaq.
It's a chilling reminder that coexistence, it was often marked by conflict.
Right.
And attempts to really assert control over those indigenous populations.
It really highlights the complexities of this period. While Halifax represents British ambition, for expansion and control, it also stands as a symbol of the dispossession and resistance faced by the Mi'kmaq.
Yeah. Now let's turn our attention to another key player in the story of British colonization.
Okay.
The Hudson's Bay Company.
Ah, the HBC.
A commercial powerhouse that would leave, really an indelible mark on the Canadian landscape.
The HBC, those iconic striped blankets, those trading posts dotting the vast wilderness. It's a story of ambition, rivalry, and, a relentless pursuit of furs, wouldn't you say?
Indeed. The HBC's founding in 1670 marks this turning point in the fur trade. Two French fur traders, Radisson and de Groseilliers, they convinced British merchants to back their venture to Hudson Bay.
Right.
A region, as you know, teeming with valuable beaver pelts.
And they struck fur gold, so to speak. I mean, King Charles II was so impressed, he granted the HBC a royal charter, giving them a monopoly over this vast territory.
Rupert's land.
Exactly, covering much of what is present-day Western and Northern Canada. Talk about a land grant.
An enormous territory, rich in fur-bearing animals, and it gave the HBC unparalleled economic and political power in the region. Now, here's a key difference between the British and French approaches to the fur trade. The HBC, at least initially, they adopted this, more passive strategy. They built trading posts along the coast of Hudson Bay and just waited for First Nations to bring them furs.
So they basically set up shop and waited for the customers to come to them.
Exactly. The French, on the other hand, they were much more proactive. They ventured deep into the interior, established trading posts closer to those First Nations communities,
Right.
forged those direct relationships with indigenous traders. And, this difference in strategy would eventually lead to some pretty intense competition and conflict between these two colonial powers.
It sounds like the stage is set for a fur trade showdown.
Yeah.
But before we dive into that rivalry, let's meet some of those intrepid British explorers who ventured into that vast interior.
Yes.
Driven by a mix of adventure, of course, the lure of furs, and that persistent dream of finding a Northwest Passage.
Get ready for some epic journeys.
Yeah.
These explorers faced incredible challenges. We're talking harsh weather, unknown landscapes, encounters with diverse indigenous cultures. Their stories are, well, they're a testament to human resilience.
Absolutely.
And that insatiable desire to explore the unknown.
And their journeys, they weren't just about adventure. They were gathering this crucial information about the land, its resources, its people. This knowledge would lay the groundwork for further British expansion.
And ultimately shape the contours of Canada.
Exactly. So let's start with Henry Kelsey, a young employee of the HBC who, back in 1690, journeyed with the Cree into the heart of the prairies.
He was the first European to witness those massive buffalo herds that roamed the grasslands.
Wow.
And he wasn't just observing.
No.
He was building relationships with the indigenous people he encountered, particularly the Siksika, laying that foundation for future trade and interaction.
Talk about a trailblazer. Then we have Anthony Henday, who ventured into present-day Alberta in 1754, further extending the reach of that British fur trade. And his encounters with the Siksika are particularly interesting because they highlight this clash of economic systems.
Ende was baffled by the Siksika's initial reluctance to trade for profit. They saw trade as a way to build relationships, exchange goods, not solely as a means of accumulating wealth.
Right.
It really challenged Hende's assumptions about the nature of trade, revealed those diverse perspectives on economic activity.
And his journals give us these really fascinating glimpses into Siksika culture, like their generosity in offering him feasts of boiled buffalo meat served in woven grass baskets. It speaks to that cultural exchange that was happening alongside the pursuit of furs.
It certainly highlights the complex interplay of economic motivations, cultural encounters, and the challenges of understanding different ways of life.
And then there's Samuel Hearne, who embarked on this epic journey to the Arctic Ocean in 1770, guided by a Dene leader named Matanabe.
Hearne's journey is a testament to human endurance and the crucial role of indigenous knowledge in navigating those challenging landscapes.
Yeah.
And his journal entries vividly capture the hardships he faced, from the extreme weather to the physical exhaustion. In one passage he writes, and I quote, "My feet and legs had swelled considerably. The nails of my toes were bruised to such a degree that several of them fell off. The skin was entirely chafed off from the tops of both my feet and between every toe. For a whole day, I left the print of my feet in blood almost at every step I took."
Wow.
Just incredible.
It's hard to even imagine enduring such hardships. And these explorers' journeys, they weren't just personal adventures. They were expanding British knowledge of the land, its resources, and its people, paving the way for greater control and influence.
Precisely. Their explorations, driven by this mix of ambition, curiosity, the pursuit of wealth, they were laying the groundwork for the eventual formation of Canada. And interwoven with all this exploration was that enduring dream.
The search for the Northwest Passage.
Yes.
That mythical sea route through the Arctic.
Promising a shortcut to Asia and untold riches.
It captivated imaginations for centuries, driving countless expeditions into those treacherous waters of the North.
It's a story of human ambition, persistence, and often tragedy. The allure of a Northwest Passage led many to their deaths, lost in that icy grip of the Arctic.
The most famous example being the tragic fate of Sir John Franklin and his crew, who vanished in 1845 while searching for the elusive passage.
Their ships were later discovered trapped and crushed in the ice, a haunting reminder of the perils of Arctic exploration.
And while Roald Amundsen finally navigated the passage in 1906, it proved too dangerous and unpredictable for regular trade.
The Northwest Passage, though ultimately a practical failure, reflects a recurring theme in human history. This desire to overcome geographical barriers in pursuit of wealth, knowledge, and perhaps a touch of glory. It shaped those exploration patterns, influenced territorial claims, and continues to resonate in discussions about Arctic sovereignty. Speaking of which,
This is where history meets modern-day geopolitics. Canada claims sovereignty over the Arctic, including the Northwest Passage, citing its long history of exploration and the presence of Indigenous peoples in the region for millennia.
But as we've seen, the United States has challenged Canada's claim on several occasions, sending ships through the Northwest Passage without seeking permission, asserting its international waters.
Right. A reminder that the legacies of exploration and colonial ambition continue to shape international relations today. And it's not just about territorial claims. Control of the Arctic has implications for resource development, shipping routes, even military strategy.
And let's not forget the environmental dimension.
Right.
As climate change melts, that Arctic ice, access to resources and waterways becomes more feasible,
Of course.
raising concerns about potential environmental damage. It's a complex issue, balancing those national interests with the need to protect a fragile ecosystem.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the forces that shape our present and will continue to influence the future.
Exactly. Now, before we go deeper into those fur trade rivalries and the escalating conflicts between the British, French, and First Nations, let's take a moment to just reflect. What stands out to you about this early period of British colonization? What questions are swirling in your mind? Hold on to those thoughts, and we'll continue our deep dive, exploring the complexities of this pivotal chapter in Canadian history.
Welcome back to our deep dive into British colonization in North America. Last time we were tracing the journeys of those daring British explorers venturing into the heart of the continent. They were fueled by ambition, of course, the allure of the fur trade.
That persistent dream of finding that Northwest Passage.
Right. But their explorations also had a, profound consequence for the Indigenous people they encountered.
Yeah, their journeys, fueled by that desire for wealth and knowledge, opened up these vast territories for British expansion, but it also led to, the disruption of Indigenous ways of life, the introduction of European diseases.
Ultimately, the displacement and dispossession of First Nations from their traditional lands. Yeah. It's a complex legacy, to say the least.
It is. Their accomplishments in terms of exploration and mapping are undeniable, but we can't ignore that devastating impact that their actions had on Indigenous communities.
Yeah. It's a reminder that history is, rarely this simple narrative of heroes and villains.
Right.
It's about understanding the complexities of human motivations, the unintended consequences of actions.
And the lasting impacts of decisions made centuries ago.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And as we delve deeper into this period, we'll continue to grapple with these complexities. Now, let's shift our focus back to the economic engine that drove so much of this activity, the fur trade,
Right.
and specifically the powerful force that was the Hudson's Bay Company.
The HBC.
Yes.
The company shrouded in history, controversy.
And those iconic striped blankets.
Exactly. They played a major role in shaping the Canadian landscape, wouldn't you say?
Their impact on Canada's development is, undeniable. Remember, they were granted a monopoly over Rupert's land. This vast territory encompassing much of present-day Western and Northern Canada.
Mm-hmm.
This gave them incredible economic and political power, shaping the course of the fur trade for, decades.
They were like a mini empire within the British Empire.
They were.
But their strategy of waiting for First Nations to bring furs to their trading posts along the coast, that didn't last forever, did it?
No, it didn't. The French, as you recall, were more proactive, venturing deep into the interior to trade directly with First Nations.
Right, bypassing the HBC's coastal posts entirely.
Exactly.
And this sparked some pretty intense competition, didn't it?
Absolutely. Things got, quite heated, especially on Hudson Bay. The French, determined to challenge the HBC's dominance, they launched a series of attacks on their trading posts.
Hold on. Attacks?
Yeah.
I thought the fur trade was about economics, not warfare.
Well, economics and warfare often go hand in hand, especially when control of valuable resources is at stake. You see, in 1686, the French, led by Pierre de Troyes, they launched a surprise attack on several HBC trading posts, catching the British completely off guard.
They came through the interior, using those intricate canoe routes they had mastered.
Through their alliances with First Nations.
Right. It was a brilliant strategic move.
It was. They managed to capture several key HBC posts, including Rupert House, Moose Factory, Albany Factory, and then in 1697, they scored a major victory by capturing York Factory, the HBC's most important post.
Wow.
This was a daring naval battle led by, Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville,
Oh, right.
a French-Canadian military commander who had become legendary for his exploits.
So for a while, it looked like the French were winning this fur trade war. war.
It did.
But then the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 came along and kind of reshuffled that colonial map.
Yes, the Treaty of Utrecht was primarily aimed at bringing peace to Europe after years of war, but it had significant implications for North America as well. It returned Rupert's land, along with Acadia and Newfoundland, back to British control.
So the HBC got their territory back. But the rivalry between the British and French and their respective fur trading empires, it wasn't over.
No, it wasn't. It was this temporary truce in a much larger conflict for control of North America, a conflict that would eventually culminate in the 7 Years' War, which of course would have a decisive impact on the fate of both empires in North America. But before we get to that pivotal conflict, let's dive back into the world of exploration and meet some more of those intrepid British adventurers who were pushing the boundaries of what was known.
Okay, buckle up. We've already met Kelsey and Hende, but there were many others who ventured into that vast interior, driven by the allure of the fur trade, the search for resources, and that enduring quest for a Northwest Passage. One fascinating figure is Alexander Mackenzie, a Scottish explorer who, in 1789, set out to find a route to the Pacific Ocean.
He was determined to prove that there was this westward route to the Pacific, even if it wasn't a sea route through the Arctic.
Right.
He traveled by canoe up the mighty Mackenzie River, which was later named in his honor, reaching the Arctic Ocean. Then, in 1793, he embarked on an even more daring expedition, this time heading west across the Rocky Mountains.
Talk about pushing the boundaries. He faced some incredible challenges. Treacherous terrain, unpredictable weather, encounters with unfamiliar indigenous groups.
He relied heavily on the knowledge and guidance of the indigenous people he encountered along the way, particularly the Dene and Carrier peoples.
Right.
They provided him with crucial information about the land, helped him navigate those waterways, shared their knowledge of local resources.
It's a testament to the importance of indigenous knowledge in facilitating European exploration of North America. Without their guidance, many of these expeditions would have been impossible.
Absolutely. Mackenzie's journey across the Rockies was, well, grueling, but ultimately successful. He reached the Pacific Ocean, becoming the first European to cross the North American continent north of Mexico.
What a feat. His explorations opened up new territories for the fur trade and further solidified those British claims to the vast western reaches of North America.
Precisely. And his journeys also highlighted the importance of rivers as transportation routes, connecting the interior to the coasts, facilitating the expansion of trade and settlement.
Speaking of rivers, let's talk about the role of the fur trade in shaping the relationship between the British and First Nations. You know, it wasn't just about economic exchange.
No.
It was about forging alliances, navigating cultural differences, and ultimately contending with the power dynamics of colonization.
The fur trade was a complex and often fraught enterprise. It brought indigenous peoples and Europeans into close contact, creating those opportunities for exchange and collaboration,
Right.
but also leading to conflict and exploitation.
In some cases, the fur trade provided First Nations with access to, new goods and technologies,
Right.
but it also disrupted traditional economies and ways of life. It created these dependencies on European goods.
Introduced new diseases that ravaged indigenous populations.
Of course.
And as the demand for furs intensified, competition between those European powers and between different First Nations groups increased, leading to tensions and sometimes outright warfare.
And our sources really highlight the impact of the fur trade on various First Nations groups. We're talking about the Cree, the Haudenosaunee,
The Iroquois.
right, and the Anishinaabe.
They were drawn into these complex trade networks,
Yeah.
often playing those European powers against each other to their advantage, but also facing the challenges of maintaining their autonomy and cultural integrity in the face of those colonial pressures.
Yeah. It's a reminder that indigenous peoples were active agents in shaping the course of history.
Absolutely.
They weren't simply passive recipients of colonial policies.
No, they adapted to changing circumstances
Formed strategic alliances.
and resisted attempts to erode their sovereignty.
Their stories are really essential for understanding the nuances of this period.
And the lasting impact of the fur trade on indigenous communities.
Exactly. And as we move forward in our deep dive, we'll continue to explore these complexities, examining how the fur trade, exploration, and that clash of empires shaped the political, social, and cultural landscape of what would become Canada. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into British colonization in North America. We've been through a lot, haven't we? I mean, from that economic engine of mercantilism to the cutthroat competition of the fur trade, the search for that elusive Northwest Passage, and of course the impact of all of these events on First Nations. As we kind of wrap things up here, let's try to connect the dots and consider, some key takeaways from this pivotal period in Canadian history.
It's certainly been a journey, hasn't it? We've really seen how British ambitions, for wealth, for power, expansion, how they played out on this North American stage, shaping, the political, the social, the cultural landscape of what would become Canada. And of course, we also grappled with those complex and often tragic consequences of colonization for Indigenous peoples.
Absolutely. And it's clear that those legacies of this period, well, they're still felt today. From, the ongoing land claims and treaty negotiations to the work of reconciliation and that revitalization of Indigenous languages and cultures, those echoes of colonization, they continue to reverberate throughout Canadian society.
Absolutely. And understanding this history, it's crucial for navigating the present and shaping a future that honors the rights and contributions of all Canadians. Now, as we look back on this deep dive, I think one recurring theme is that interplay between cooperation and conflict. We've seen how those British colonists, they relied on Indigenous knowledge and alliances to navigate this vast wilderness, right? And to establish their presence in North America.
Think about those explorers we've talked about, Kelsey, Henry, Hearne, Mackenzie.
Right.
They all depended on those Indigenous guides, the interpreters, the trading partners to survive and achieve their goals. The fur trade itself really was built on this complex network of relationships between Indigenous peoples and those European traders.
Precisely. But alongside these moments of cooperation, we also see this pattern of conflict and displacement. Competition for land, for resources and power often led to tensions, to skirmishes and outright warfare. And the Beothuk story is this tragic reminder of the devastating impact that colonization could have on Indigenous populations.
And we can't forget those clashes between the British and the French.
Of course not.
As they vied for control of, that lucrative fur trade. Those rivalries really shaped the political landscape of North America for decades, culminating in the Seven Years' War.
A global conflict with a decisive impact on the future of both empires.
A pivotal turning point for sure.
Absolutely. The Seven Years' War, which raged from 1756 to 1763, resulted in a British victory, with France ceding its territories in North America to Britain. So this victory, it solidified British control over, what's present-day Canada, and really laid the groundwork for the eventual Confederation of Canada in 1867.
So the Seven Years' War, it marks the end of French colonial rule in North America.
But it's also the beginning of this new chapter in the relationship between Britain and First Nations. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, issued by King George III, acknowledged those Indigenous rights to their lands and established a framework for negotiating treaties.
That Royal Proclamation, it was a landmark document, wasn't it?
It was, recognizing Indigenous peoples as nations with those inherent rights to their territories. It established a process for negotiating treaties between the Crown and First Nations, a process that, as you know, continues to this day. However, the implementation of that proclamation, it was often inconsistent. And, many treaties were later broken or misinterpreted, leading to, the ongoing land claims and disputes.
It's a reminder that even when well-intentioned, those colonial policies could have, unintended and often harmful consequences for Indigenous peoples. And the legacy of these broken promises continues to shape the relationship between Indigenous communities and the Canadian government today.
Absolutely. Now, as we reflect on this complex history, let's consider this. How might the story of British colonization in North America, how might it have unfolded differently if those early explorers and colonists, what if they had approached their encounters with First Nations from a place of respect, recognizing those inherent rights and sovereignty?
It's a challenging question, but an important one to consider. What if, instead of viewing Indigenous lands as, empty spaces ripe for the taking, they'd acknowledge those Indigenous peoples as nations with their own laws, cultures, and systems of governance? How might that relationship between, the newcomers and Indigenous peoples have evolved differently?
It's interesting to think about, isn't it? Imagine, a scenario where treaties were negotiated on a nation-to-nation basis with a genuine commitment to, upholding Indigenous rights and sharing the land and its resources equitably. It's a hypothetical scenario, but it invites us to consider, alternative paths, to imagine a history where collaboration and understanding triumphed over exploitation and conflict.
It challenges us to think about, the choices that were made, the missed opportunities for that peaceful coexistence, and, the possibility of building a nation together based on that mutual respect and shared prosperity.
Precisely. And while we can't change the past, we can learn from it, right? And strive to build a more just and equitable future, recognizing those lasting impacts of colonization and understanding those complexities of the relationship between indigenous peoples and newcomers. Well, it's essential for moving forward as a nation.
So our deep dive into British colonization, it wasn't just about, unearthing those historical facts. It was about understanding the roots of Canada, those complex relationships between Indigenous peoples and newcomers, and the enduring legacies of decisions made centuries ago.
It's about recognizing that history, well, it's not just a collection of dusty stories. It's this living force that shapes who we are today and guides us as we navigate those challenges and opportunities of the future.
And I hope this journey through British colonization has been as as enlightening and thought-provoking for you as it has been for me. And I encourage you to, continue exploring, questioning, and engaging with those complexities of our shared history.
Until next time, keep diving deep.